The bank's locksmith had just sealed the gates when Duke Hughes set a small cardboard box on the sidewalk. Inside were a family photograph, an old leather wallet, and the only house key that no longer opened anything. Across the driveway, his wife climbed into a black SUV, slipped off her wedding ring, placed it beside the box, and drove away without looking back. Snow began to settle on the forgotten ring. Then a woman wearing a faded brown work apron crossed the street carrying a steaming pot of chicken soup. She softly called his name, and for the first time that day someone saw the man instead of the fallen billionaire. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if stories about kindness, second chances, and the people who stay when everyone else leaves speak to your heart, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined us for more. Long before his name appeared on magazine covers or was engraved on polished brass plaques outside luxury showrooms, Duke Hughes was simply the boy who swept sawdust from the cracked concrete floor of his father's garage in Asheville, North Carolina. Every afternoon after school, he would pull on a pair of oversized work gloves, pick up curls of fragrant oak and walnut, and watch his father transform rough pieces of timber into dining tables sturdy enough to survive generations. His father often repeated the same sentence without ever raising his voice. Wood remembers the hands that respect it. For years, Duke believed his father was talking only about furniture. Much later, he would discover the old man had been speaking about people all along. The garage had no heating, except a rusted stove that crackled throughout the winter. Summers were just as unforgiving, with thick humidity settling over every surface until sweat dripped from the brim of Duke's baseball cap. Yet he never complained. He loved the rhythm of honest work, the scrape of sandpaper, the scent of fresh cedar, the satisfaction of watching something beautiful emerge from what others considered ordinary lumber. When his father passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack, Duke was only 24. Friends suggested selling the tiny workshop before debt swallowed it. The bank manager quietly advised him to find a safer career. Even relatives hinted that handcrafted furniture belonged to another era. Instead, Duke unlocked the garage the following Monday morning and went back to work. He repaired antique rocking chairs during the day, delivered dining tables in the evening, and spent nights sketching new designs under a single yellow lamp. For nearly a decade, success came one customer at a time. Then a photograph changed everything. A famous interior designer happened to post a picture of one of Duke's handcrafted walnut tables in a luxury mountain lodge. Orders flooded in from across the country. Hotels wanted custom furniture. Architects requested entire collections. Boutique resorts began competing for production slots months in advance. The little garage became Hughes Artisan Furniture. The workshop became a factory. The factory became one of North Carolina's most respected furniture companies, employing hundreds of craftsmen whose names Duke insisted on learning personally. Reporters loved calling him the Billionaire Carpenter. Duke hated the nickname. "I'm still a carpenter," he would answer during interviews. "The company simply got bigger." It was during those years of explosive growth that he met Eleanor Hughes. She was graceful, intelligent, and effortlessly elegant. She had studied art history and possessed a gift for hosting charity galas that attracted politicians, celebrities, and business leaders. Together, they became one of Asheville's most admired couples. Their estate overlooked rolling blue mountains. The house featured enormous windows, stone fireplaces, and handcrafted furniture from Duke's own workshop. Every room reflected quiet luxury rather than flashy extravagance. At least that was how Duke saw it. Others noticed something different. As the company grew, Eleanor became increasingly fascinated by prestige. Invitations mattered, designer gowns mattered, magazine features mattered. She rarely missed an opportunity to remind guests which collectors owned their furniture or which famous hotel had commissioned the newest collection. Duke usually smiled politely before slipping away from the ballroom to check on employees, setting up tables, or moving heavy displays. He felt far more comfortable beside workers than cameras. Every December, the Hughes family hosted a holiday dinner for employees who had no relatives nearby. Kitchen staff cleaners, gardeners, drivers' maintenance workers, and office assistants all sat together beneath sparkling chandeliers. Among them was Grace Turner. Grace had worked in the Hughes household for over 15 years. She never arrived without wearing the same faded brown work apron. The fabric had become soft with age, and one corner had been carefully stitched by hand after tearing years earlier. Most people assumed it was simply an old piece of work clothing. To Grace, it was priceless. Her late mother had sewn it decades before, insisting that honest work deserved clean hands and a proud heart. Whenever Grace tied its worn strings behind her back each morning, she quietly remembered those words. She wasn't invisible inside the house, but she often felt overlooked. Guests thanked the chefs, they complimented the decorators, they praised the flowers. Few noticed the woman who polished every staircase before sunrise or folded hundreds of fresh towels every week. Grace never complained. She believed dignity didn't depend on applause. One snowy December evening, after the annual employee dinner, Duke wandered into the kitchen searching for leftover apple pie before heading back to his office. The celebration had already ended. Only Grace remained, washing serving bowls beneath warm water while softly humming an old church hymn. "You should have gone home hours ago," Duke said. Grace smiled without stopping. "Someone has to make sure tomorrow starts clean." Duke laughed quietly. "Fair point." He noticed her apron hanging slightly crooked after a long day. "You've had that apron forever?" Grace glanced down and brushed a little flower from its front pocket. "My mama made it." "Looks like it could outlive both of us." "It probably will." The two shared a brief laugh before Duke filled 2 mugs with coffee from the nearly empty pot. They stood in comfortable silence. No photographers, no board members, no investors. Just 2 people finishing another long day of work. Moments like that were rare in Duke's increasingly crowded life. He respected every employee who worked beside him, but respect alone couldn't replace presence. He rarely knew who was struggling. He seldom asked what happened after people drove home. Business consumed nearly every waking hour. There were scholarship requests stacked on his desk every month. Hundreds of applications from families needing help with tuition, vocational training, or apprenticeships. Duke signed dozens of approvals after careful recommendations from the company's charitable foundation. One file in particular carried the name Noah Turner. Duke reviewed it late one evening between conference calls. The recommendation praised an exceptionally talented young man who dreamed of becoming a mechanical technician but couldn't afford trade school after losing his father. Without hesitation, Duke signed the approval, closed the folder, and moved on to the next document. Within minutes, the memory disappeared beneath contracts, production schedules, and expansion plans. He never knew whose future had quietly changed that night. Outside his office window, Grace walked across the courtyard, wearing the same brown apron, carrying a bag of leftover bread she planned to share with an elderly neighbor before going home. Neither of them realized that years later, after wealth titles and every symbol of success had vanished, that simple apron, and the kindness quietly stitched into it, would become the thread holding one broken life together. For nearly 30 years, Hughes Artisan Furniture had been more than a successful company. It was one of the largest private employers in western North Carolina, a place where entire families worked side by side. Fathers taught sons how to shape walnut into heirloom dining tables. Mothers inspected handcrafted cabinets before they left the factory. Employees celebrated birthdays together, attended each other's weddings, and mourned together when someone passed away. Duke Hughes often said that a workshop should sound alive. "The day I stop hearing laughter between the machines," he once told his managers, "is the day we've forgotten why we're here." Most people believed the company was indestructible. They didn't know that the first cracks had appeared years earlier. Those cracks had a name. Victor Langley. Victor had met Duke when both men were in their early 30s. While Duke understood wood production and craftsmanship, Victor spoke the language of investors, banks, and expansion. Calm, polished, and endlessly confident, he convinced Duke that Hughes Artisan Furniture could become a national luxury brand. For years, Victor seemed indispensable. He negotiated contracts. He secured financing. He handled acquisitions. Whenever Duke questioned complicated financial reports, Victor would smile patiently. "Leave the numbers to me. You build furniture. I'll build the business." It sounded reasonable. Little by little, Duke stopped asking difficult questions. He trusted the man he called his closest friend. Meanwhile, life inside the Hughes mansion became increasingly elegant and increasingly distant. Eleanor embraced the spotlight with remarkable ease. She chaired charity galas, hosted fundraisers in the estate's grand ballroom, and appeared regularly in lifestyle magazines that praised her taste in art, fashion, and entertaining. The mansion was rarely quiet anymore. There were always guests, planners, photographers, caterers, or decorators preparing for the next event. Duke attended when he could, but he often slipped away before dessert. Instead of discussing investment portfolios over expensive wine, he preferred walking through the factory after sunset, checking unfinished projects, and thanking employees working overtime. Those late-night visits became a tradition. Grace Turner noticed them more than anyone. She usually finished cleaning shortly after 10 o'clock. Almost every week, she would pass Duke carrying a toolbox instead of a briefcase, tightening a loose cabinet hinge, or adjusting a workshop display himself. "You know maintenance can handle that," Grace once teased. Duke smiled. "I know." "Then why do it yourself?" "My father used to say that if a boss forgets how to hold a screwdriver, he'll eventually forget how hard everyone else works." Grace nodded. "I think your father was a wise man." Those simple conversations never lasted more than a few minutes, but they revealed the man beneath the billionaire's reputation. A man who still felt most comfortable with his sleeves rolled up. Yet while Duke remained connected to the workshop floor, he had slowly drifted away from the boardroom where the company's greatest danger was quietly growing. Victor had become increasingly ambitious. He pushed for rapid expansion into luxury developments across the country. He borrowed aggressively. He created layers of holding companies that few directors fully understood. Every proposal promised larger profits. Every presentation ended with impressive charts. Whenever someone raised concerns, Victor dismissed them as fear of progress. "We're competing nationally now," he would insist. "Small-town thinking won't keep us alive." Duke wasn't entirely convinced. Still, quarterly reports showed record revenue. Banks continued extending credit. Industry awards kept arriving. Nothing appeared wrong. Then the first shipment was unexpectedly delayed. A major supplier claimed invoices hadn't been paid. Victor blamed an accounting error. 2 weeks later, another vendor refused to deliver hardwood until outstanding balances were settled. Victor again had an explanation. Temporary cash flow issue. Duke accepted it. He wanted to believe the company he had built with his own hands couldn't possibly be standing on unstable ground. But the warning signs multiplied. Employees began quietly asking payroll questions. Department managers noticed approved budgets suddenly disappearing. A planned apprenticeship program was postponed without explanation. One Friday afternoon, Duke walked into Victor's office holding a stack of unpaid supplier notices. "I thought these were resolved." Victor barely looked up from his laptop. "They will be." "When?" Victor sighed dramatically. "You worry too much. I'm responsible for 800 families, and I'm protecting all of them." Duke stared at him for several long seconds. Something felt different, not the words. The confidence. Victor no longer sounded reassuring. He sounded impatient. That evening, Duke drove home later than usual. The mansion glowed with warm light as dozens of luxury cars lined the circular driveway. Another gala, another celebration. Inside, Eleanor stood beneath a crystal chandelier, speaking with guests from New York and Chicago. She noticed Duke's tired expression immediately. "Smile," she whispered while adjusting his tie. "I've had a difficult day." "So have I." He looked around the crowded room. "It doesn't seem like it." She lowered her voice. "Appearances matter." Duke forced a smile for the photographers. But during dinner he barely touched his food. Instead, he kept thinking about unpaid invoices and Victor's unusually defensive attitude. Across the room, Grace quietly refilled water glasses and cleared empty plates. She noticed Duke staring absently at nothing. As guests laughed over expensive champagne, she placed a fresh cup of black coffee beside him without saying a word. It was exactly how he liked it. No sugar, no cream. Duke looked up and smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Grace. You look exhausted." "I'll be all right." She hesitated before speaking again. "My husband used to say that when people stop answering simple questions, it's because they're hiding complicated truths." Duke gave a faint chuckle. "I'll remember that." Neither of them realized how important those words would soon become. The following Monday morning, the nightmare truly began. Federal auditors arrived without warning. Bank representatives requested immediate meetings. Trading partners suspended contracts. News outlets started calling every few minutes. Then came the phone call Duke would never forget. His chief accountant's voice shook so violently that several words were almost impossible to understand. "Duke, we've found accounts. Millions are missing." "That's impossible." "I wish it was." Within hours, financial investigators filled conference rooms. Computer servers were seized. Documents disappeared into evidence boxes. Employees gathered silently outside offices, whispering rumors that grew darker with every passing hour. Victor Langley was nowhere to be found. His phone had been disconnected. His assistant hadn't seen him since dawn. By sunset, television news vans were parked outside the factory gates. Headlines flashed across every screen. "Billionaire furniture mogul under financial investigation." Former supporters refused interviews. Investors demanded answers. Competitors celebrated quietly. Standing alone inside his office, Duke looked through the large factory window at hundreds of workers leaving the building with frightened faces. For the first time since opening his father's tiny garage decades earlier, he realized something terrifying. He no longer feared losing his fortune. He feared failing every family that had trusted him to build a future. And outside the mansion that evening, unnoticed by reporters gathering near the gates, Grace Turner folded her old brown apron after another long day, unaware that before long, the grand house she had cared for so faithfully would stand silent. And the man who had once owned it would have nowhere left to call home. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours, Hughes Artisan Furniture became the leading story on every local news station in North Carolina. Helicopters hovered above the factory. Cameras waited outside the corporate headquarters from sunrise until late at night. Every headline seemed to assume Duke Hughes had masterminded the collapse himself, even though investigators repeatedly described him as cooperating fully. Public opinion didn't wait for evidence. It rarely did. The board of directors called an emergency meeting on a gray Tuesday morning. Duke entered the conference room carrying nothing except a worn leather notebook that had belonged to his father. Around the polished walnut table sat people who had toasted his success for years. Now few would even meet his eyes. One director cleared his throat. "We believe it would be in everyone's best interest if you resigned immediately." Another added, "The company needs distance from this scandal." Duke looked slowly around the room. "Do any of you honestly believe I stole from this company?" Silence answered him. Not one person defended him. not even those who had worked beside him for decades. He nodded once. "I understand." Without arguing, he signed his resignation. The pen felt strangely heavy in his hand. As he stood to leave, he paused beside the framed photograph hanging near the door. It showed the original workshop from nearly 30 years earlier, a tiny garage with peeling paint, his father smiling proudly beside a handmade oak table. Duke touched the corner of the frame for just a moment before walking away. Outside, reporters rushed toward him. "Mr. Hughes, did you know about the missing money? Are you declaring bankruptcy? Did you deceive your investors?" He kept walking. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. By Friday morning, the court approved emergency asset protection measures while the investigation continued. The mansion overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains was officially seized. 2 sheriff's deputies and representatives from the bank arrived shortly after 9 o'clock. They were polite, almost apologetic. But procedures were procedures. Duke wandered slowly through the empty house, while movers cataloged furniture, artwork, and valuables. The grand staircase looked strangely unfamiliar without guests. The dining room, once filled with laughter during employee holiday dinners, echoed with silence. In his study, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside lay an old tape measure, a carpenter's pencil, and the pocket knife his father had carried every day. He slipped them into a small cardboard box. Nothing else. He didn't reach for expensive watches. He ignored framed awards. He left behind tailored suits that no longer seemed important. When he carried the box downstairs, Eleanor was already waiting near the entrance. She looked immaculate, dressed in a cream-colored coat, despite the chaos surrounding them. Her attorney stood several feet away, quietly reviewing documents. "I've signed everything," she said. Duke looked at her. "What things?" "The divorce papers." He stared at the envelope in her hands. "So that's it." She hesitated only briefly. "I can't live like this, Duke. This uncertainty." He glanced around the nearly empty foyer. "You mean poverty?" Eleanor sighed. "I mean survival. I thought we promised to survive together." Her expression hardened. "We promised many things." She handed him the envelope. "There isn't anything left to hold on to." Duke didn't open it. There was no anger, only exhaustion. After 31 years of marriage, their conversation ended in less than 3 minutes. As movers carried the last boxes outside, Eleanor removed her wedding ring. She placed it gently on top of Duke's cardboard box. "I'm sorry." Then she walked toward a waiting black SUV. The vehicle disappeared beyond the gates without slowing. Duke remained standing in the driveway until the sound of the engine faded completely. Snowflakes drifted quietly through the cold afternoon air. He realized he was no longer looking at his home. It had already become someone else's property. The first night he checked into a roadside motel just outside town. The room cost $68. The heater rattled loudly every few minutes. The mattress sagged in the middle. The wallpaper peeled near the window. Yet none of those things bothered him. What unsettled him most was the silence. For decades, every hour of his day had been filled with meetings, employees, suppliers, clients, and phone calls. Now his phone barely rang. He began making calls himself. First, an investor who had once called Duke family. Voicemail. Then an old golfing partner. No answer. A former senator who had attended countless charity dinners. His assistant politely explained he was unavailable. Another businessman promised to return the call. He never did. By evening, Duke had called 16 people. Not one conversation lasted longer than 30 seconds. He set the phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling. It was astonishing how quickly admiration disappeared when success did. The following afternoon, hunger finally forced him outside. He drove aimlessly before stopping at Harold's Diner, a modest neighborhood restaurant he hadn't visited in years. The lunch crowd had almost disappeared. Harold Jenkins looked up from behind the counter. For a brief moment, surprise crossed his face. Then he smiled, exactly as he always had. "Coffee?" Duke nodded. "Please." Harold poured a fresh cup without mentioning the news. No awkward questions, no pity, just hot coffee. Duke ordered the cheapest meal on the menu, grilled cheese with tomato soup. He ate slowly, watching ordinary people continue their lives outside the window. Construction workers laughed over lunch. A mother hurried across the street, holding her little daughter's hand. An elderly couple shared a slice of pie. The world hadn't stopped, simply because his had. As Harold refilled his coffee, he spoke quietly. "You know, folks around here still remember the man who sponsored the high school's woodworking competition every spring." Duke looked down. "I don't know if they remember." "I do." Before Duke could answer, the front door chimed. A woman stepped inside, carrying a neatly folded winter coat over one arm. She wore a familiar, faded brown apron beneath it. Grace Turner. She had come to pick up sandwiches Harold donated every Friday for elderly neighbors from her church. She thanked Harold, turned toward the door, and froze. For a long moment, neither she nor Duke spoke. The elegant billionaire she had once worked for now sat alone in a corner booth, wearing the same coat he had been wearing 3 days earlier. His shoulders looked smaller. His eyes carried a weariness she had never seen before. Grace didn't stare. She simply walked toward his table. "Duke." He looked up slowly. "Hello, Grace." There was no judgment in her face. No curiosity. Only quiet concern. She noticed the untouched half of his sandwich, the cheap motel key lying beside his coffee cup, and the cardboard box resting on the empty seat across from him. Without asking another question, Grace gently sat down across from him. For the first time since losing everything, Duke realized someone had chosen to sit beside him, not because of who he had been, but because of who he still was. Grace looked at the cardboard box before looking back at Duke. "You packed light." A faint smile crossed his face. "It turns out you don't own as much as you think." Neither of them laughed. Harold quietly placed a fresh basket of warm cornbread on the table, without interrupting. As he walked away, he switched the small sign on the front door from open to back in 5 minutes. The lunch rush was over, and he understood that some conversations deserved privacy. Grace wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I've been watching the news." "I wish you hadn't." "I stopped after the first day." Duke lowered his eyes. "They're saying a lot of things." "I know. Some people already think I stole everything." Grace answered without hesitation. "I don't." Her certainty caught him off guard. "You didn't even ask what happened." "I worked in your house for 15 years. She shrugged gently. "I don't need television to tell me who you are." Those simple words settled into the silence between them. For nearly a week, Duke had defended himself before lawyers, investigators, journalists, and strangers on the internet. None of their questions had felt as honest as Grace's complete lack of suspicion. After a long pause, she asked softly, "Where are you staying?" "A motel near the interstate." "Is it decent?" "It has a roof." She understood what that meant. "And after that," he hesitated. "I haven't thought that far." Grace knew he was lying. He had thought about it every hour since leaving the mansion. He simply had no answer. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. "I have a room." Duke looked at the key, but didn't touch it. "My sewing shop has a little apartment in the back. It used to belong to my mother." He immediately shook his head. "I couldn't." "You could." "I won't." Grace wasn't offended. Instead, she carefully placed the key on the table between them. "You don't have to answer today." "I appreciate it." "You don't have to thank me either." Duke pushed the key gently back toward her. "I've spent my whole life taking care of myself." Grace smiled kindly. "And how's that working this week?" He had no response. When they left the diner, snow had begun falling again. Grace carried 2 paper bags filled with sandwiches for elderly members of her church. Duke instinctively reached for one. "Let me help." "You don't have to." "I know." He carried the heavier bag to her pickup truck, an aging blue Ford with nearly 200,000 miles on the odometer. The driver's door creaked loudly as she opened it. "I've been meaning to fix that hinge." Duke looked at it. "I could probably repair it." "I know you could." She smiled, "But not today." Before climbing inside, she looked at him once more. "If you change your mind about the room," she nodded toward the key still resting in his palm. "Keep it." Then she drove away. Duke stood in the parking lot for several minutes, staring at the small brass key. It weighed almost nothing, yet accepting it somehow felt heavier than signing away his company. That evening he returned to the motel. The manager stopped him near the reception desk. "Mr. Hughes?" "Yes." "I'm sorry, but your card was declined." Duke frowned. "It shouldn't have been." "The bank rejected it twice." He quietly reached into his wallet. There were 3 $20 bills and some loose change. "Cash is fine." After paying, he counted what remained. $34. He had once approved multi-million-dollar investments with a single signature. Now he mentally calculated whether he could afford breakfast. Inside the room, sleep refused to come. The heater coughed cold air before finally warming up. Somewhere outside, a freight train echoed through the darkness. Duke sat on the edge of the bed holding the brass key. His pride argued fiercely against using it. He wasn't homeless. He wasn't helpless. He could solve this. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow someone would return his calls. Tomorrow the investigation would clear his name. Tomorrow. The word repeated itself until nearly dawn. Morning brought no miracles. 2 more business contacts declined meetings. A recruiter politely explained that no board would hire someone under federal investigation, regardless of guilt. One former friend suggested waiting until everything blows over. Everything. As though losing a lifetime's work were a passing storm. That afternoon, Duke drove to the factory one last time. Security officers stood outside the gates. One of them recognized him immediately. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hughes." "It's all right. I can't let anyone in." Duke nodded. "I know." He stood across the street watching employees leave at the end of their shift. Some noticed him. A few waved awkwardly. Others looked away, uncertain what to say. One older carpenter quietly removed his cap as he walked past. It was a gesture of respect, nothing more. Yet it nearly broke Duke's composure. He drove away before anyone could see the tears gathering in his eyes. That night, temperatures dropped below freezing. The motel's heating system failed just after midnight. Guests complained into the hallway. The manager apologized, but explained that repairs couldn't begin until morning. Wrapped in his coat, Duke sat inside his rental sedan with the engine running for warmth. He watched snow collect on the windshield. The fuel gauge moved lower every 30 minutes. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, he turned off the engine to save the remaining gasoline. Silence settled around him. He suddenly understood how frightening loneliness became after midnight. Not because the world was dangerous, because there was no one left to call. As dawn slowly brightened the sky, Duke reached into his coat pocket. His fingers touched the brass key. For several minutes, he simply stared at it. Then he started the car. Half an hour later, he pulled onto a quiet side street lined with small brick storefronts. A modest sign read, "Turner Alterations and Repairs." The display window held neatly tailored jackets, repaired backpacks, children's school uniforms, and hand-sewn quilts. Grace was already outside, sweeping fresh snow from the sidewalk. She looked up as the familiar rental sedan stopped across the street. Neither of them spoke. Duke stepped out carrying only the same cardboard box. He walked slowly toward her, stopping a few feet away. Without lifting his eyes, he held out the brass key. "I think—" His voice cracked for the first time. "I could use that room." Grace didn't smile with triumph. She didn't say, "I told you so." She simply took the broom, leaned it against the wall, opened the shop door, and answered with the same quiet dignity she had carried her entire life. "Come inside." The warmth inside Turner Alterations and Repairs felt different from the warmth of the mansion Duke had lost. There were no marble floors, no grand staircase, no expensive artwork hanging on perfectly painted walls. Instead, the little shop smelled of fresh, coffee-clean fabric cedar drawers and the faint scent of lavender from handmade sachets Grace tucked into every repaired coat before returning it to customers. It wasn't luxurious. It simply felt lived in. Grace locked the front door for another 10 minutes before leading Duke through a narrow hallway behind the sewing room. "The apartment isn't much," she said. "It doesn't need to be." She opened a white wooden door. The room was barely 400 square feet. A small bed stood against one wall, beneath a quilt stitched from pieces of old shirts. A bookshelf held dozens of worn novels and several Bibles. There was a tiny kitchenette with mismatched mugs hanging beneath the cabinet. Morning sunlight slipped through lace curtains, filling the room with a gentle glow. "My mother lived here until she passed," Grace explained quietly. "I've kept it almost exactly the way she left it." Duke set the cardboard box beside the bed. "It's beautiful." She smiled. "It isn't." "It is." She looked around the room. "I guess beauty depends on who's looking." Duke nodded slowly. "I've spent too many years looking at price tags." Grace didn't answer. She simply handed him a folded towel. "Bathroom's through that door." "Thank you." "And breakfast is at 7. You don't have to feed me." "I know." She smiled again. "But I'm making pancakes anyway." For the first time in several days, Duke took a hot shower without thinking about checkout times, bank balances, or television cameras. When he looked into the small mirror afterward, the man staring back seemed older than 58. Dark circles framed his tired eyes. Gray hair had become more noticeable during the past week. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of invisible losses. Yet something else had changed. The constant panic that had followed him since leaving the mansion seemed quieter here. Perhaps because nobody expected him to pretend. At exactly 7, the smell of pancakes drifted upstairs. Grace had already set a tiny kitchen table for 2. There were scrambled eggs, homemade blackberry jam, and coffee served in thick, ceramic mugs with tiny chips around the rims. Duke instinctively reached for his wallet. Grace noticed immediately. "If you try paying me for breakfast, I'll be offended." "I wasn't." "You were," he sighed. "I don't like feeling indebted." She poured more coffee. "My mother used to say neighbors don't keep receipts." The words lingered in the room long after breakfast ended. Around 8 o'clock, Grace unlocked the front door. Customers began arriving almost immediately. A schoolteacher needed a torn sleeve repaired before class. An elderly veteran brought in an old army jacket with missing buttons. A young mother asked Grace to shorten her son's school uniform because he had suddenly grown several inches over the summer. Each customer greeted Grace by name. Most had known her for years. Duke quietly stayed in the back room, uncertain whether he should be seen. Then Grace called toward him. "Duke?" He stepped into the shop. "Would you help me carry those chairs from storage?" He looked surprised. "Of course." Behind the building stood a small storage shed packed with old furniture waiting to be repaired before resale. Grace pointed toward 4 wooden dining chairs. "I usually refinish these myself." Duke ran his fingers across one of the cracked legs, solid white oak, hand-cut joinery, poor repair work from decades earlier. Without thinking, he smiled. I know exactly what's wrong. Grace noticed something she hadn't seen in days. Purpose. She handed him a toolbox. You know where everything goes better than I do. He knelt beside the first chair. His movements were slow, at first almost uncertain. Then memory took over. He removed damaged screws, cleaned old glue from the joints, measured replacement dowels, adjusted the alignment with remarkable precision. Hours disappeared. For the first time since losing his company, Duke wasn't thinking about lawyers or investigations. He was simply fixing something broken. Grace watched quietly from her sewing machine inside the shop. Every so often she glanced through the back window. Each time she saw the same thing. Duke working. Around lunchtime she walked outside carrying 2 sandwiches. You forgot to eat. He looked up surprised. I guess I did. She sat beside him on an overturned crate. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Duke broke the silence. I've missed this. Repairing furniture. He nodded. I used to spend every day building things. What changed? I became responsible for meetings instead of people. Grace handed him half of her sandwich. My husband used to say hands can tell when they're doing honest work. Duke looked down at his palms. Small splinters had worked their way beneath his skin. His fingertips were rough again. Oddly enough, it felt comforting. The afternoon passed quickly. By closing time, all 4 chairs stood perfectly restored. Grace stared at them in disbelief. I would have spent 3 days on those. Duke smiled modestly. I had good teachers. Just then the front bell chimed. A middle-aged couple entered looking for a refurbished dining set. Grace led them toward the back. The husband stopped beside the restored chairs. These are beautiful. They're for sale, Grace replied. He examined every detail carefully. Who restored them? Grace glanced toward Duke. Before she could answer, the customer recognized him. His eyebrows shot upward. Wait. He stepped closer. Aren't you Duke Hughes? Silence filled the room. The man's wife looked equally shocked. The billionaire! Duke felt his stomach tighten. He suddenly became aware of his faded jeans, dusty work boots, and flannel shirt borrowed from Grace's late husband. He opened his mouth. No words came. The customer looked again at the repaired chairs. You did these? Duke nodded once. I did. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then the man smiled. They're the finest craftsmanship I've seen in years. Relief washed over Duke, until another customer entering behind them whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. I saw him on the news. The whisper spread. Within moments, several people in the shop were looking directly at Duke. Some with curiosity, others with sympathy, a few with unmistakable judgment. Duke instinctively reached toward the old brown apron hanging beside Grace's workbench, intending to remove it before anyone looked more closely. Grace gently stopped his hand. She untied the apron from its hook, shook out the wrinkles, and held it toward him. You forgot this. He hesitated. They're staring. She met his eyes with calm certainty. They're looking. There's a difference. Without another word, she tied the faded brown apron around his waist herself. Then she turned toward the waiting customers. My friend repaired every one of these chairs. Her voice remained steady. And around here we judge people by the work they do, not by yesterday's headlines. The room fell completely silent. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, Duke stood in full view of strangers wearing an old work apron instead of an expensive tailored suit. And to his own surprise, he no longer felt ashamed. By the end of the week, the old brown apron no longer felt unfamiliar. Every morning, Grace untied it from the wooden hook beside the back door and handed it to Duke without ceremony. Every evening, he folded it carefully before placing it back in exactly the same place. Neither of them ever spoke about the ritual. It simply became part of the day. Duke soon discovered that Grace's shop survived on dozens of small jobs that most people never noticed. One customer needed a zipper replaced on a winter coat. Another wanted an old baby blanket patched instead of thrown away. A retired teacher brought in curtains that had belonged to her late husband because she couldn't bear to replace them. Grace repaired everything with the same patience. "It isn't just fabric," she explained one afternoon, while carefully sewing the torn sleeve of a child's jacket. "Every stitch belongs to someone's story." Duke looked around the tiny workshop. For years he had measured success by quarterly profits, production numbers, and expansion plans. Here success looked completely different. It was an elderly widow smiling because her husband's favorite flannel shirt could be worn again. It was a little girl hugging the backpack her grandmother couldn't afford to replace. It was one more family keeping a few extra dollars because something old had been repaired instead of discarded. Those victories never appeared in newspapers, yet somehow they felt more real. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, business slowed to a crawl. Grace switched off the sewing machine and poured 2 cups of coffee. "The weather usually keeps folks home." Duke accepted the mug. "I've forgotten what a quiet afternoon feels like." She laughed softly. "You've probably forgotten a lot of ordinary things." "I have." Outside, rain tapped steadily against the front window. Inside, neither of them seemed in a hurry to speak. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "Do you remember my husband?" Duke searched his memory. "Daniel." She smiled. "You do remember?" "He came to one Christmas dinner." "He came to 2. Grace looked down into her coffee. "He worked construction." "I remember he had a loud laugh." "He did." Her smile faded. "He also believed he was indestructible." Duke remained silent. One morning a scaffold collapsed. She spoke calmly, but every word carried years of quiet grief. "He survived the fall." Duke relaxed slightly. "For 3 days. The room fell silent again. "The doctors tried everything." She looked toward the rain-covered window. "Noah was only 14. Duke slowly set down his coffee. "I'm sorry, Grace." "So was I." She gave a small, bittersweet smile. "But sorrow doesn't stop the bills from arriving." After Daniel died, Grace found herself juggling 2 cleaning jobs while caring for her aging mother and trying to keep Noah in school. Some weeks there wasn't enough money for groceries after paying rent. Other weeks the electricity bill came first. "There was one night," she said quietly, "when Noah told me he'd leave school and find work." Duke listened without interrupting. He thought he was helping. "What did you tell him?" "I told him children shouldn't have to rescue their parents." She looked down at her hands. "But I wasn't sure I believed my own words." Noah began applying for vocational schools anyway, hoping to become a mechanical technician. He was accepted into an excellent program. The tuition might as well have been $1 million. I remember opening the acceptance letter. Grace smiled faintly. It was the happiest and saddest day at the same time. What happened? A month later, another envelope arrived. She stood and walked toward an old filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the workshop. From the bottom drawer, she removed a neatly folded document inside a clear plastic sleeve. "I've kept it all these years." She handed it to Duke. Across the top of the letter appeared the logo of the Hughes Artisan Foundation. Below it was a scholarship approval notice. Duke recognized the signature immediately. His own. He read the name. Noah Turner. The memory returned only as scattered fragments. Late evenings, stacks of scholarship applications, dozens of signatures. He looked at Grace. "I honestly don't remember." "I know. You never told me." "There wasn't any reason." He looked back at the letter. "I changed your son's life and didn't even know it." Grace shook her head gently. "You opened a door." She pointed toward the window. "Noah walked through it himself. At that moment, the front door opened. A young man in his mid-20s stepped inside, carrying a weathered toolbox. He had broad shoulders, kind brown eyes, and grease stains on his work jacket. "Mom," Grace smiled. "Perfect timing." She turned toward Duke. "This is Noah." The young man stopped in surprise. For a brief second, he simply stared. Then recognition spread across his face. "Mr. Hughes." Duke stood. "It's good to finally meet you." Noah crossed the room and extended his hand without hesitation. "It should have happened years ago." Duke accepted the handshake. "I hear you're a mechanic." "Industrial equipment." Noah grinned. "I spend most of my days fixing machines people have given up on." Duke couldn't help smiling. "I know something about that." The three of them shared lunch together in the tiny apartment upstairs. Noah spoke enthusiastically about rebuilding old engines and repairing factory equipment throughout western North Carolina. Every so often he mentioned something he had learned in trade school. Each story quietly traced back to the scholarship Duke had signed years earlier. After lunch, Noah looked directly at Duke. "You know what my mother always told me?" Duke shook his head. "She said one act of kindness isn't supposed to stop with the person who receives it." Grace looked embarrassed. "I talked too much." "No," Noah replied. "You talked just enough." He leaned back in his chair. "When I finished school, I promised myself I'd always take one apprentice who couldn't afford training." "You do that?" Duke asked. "Every year." Duke looked from Noah to Grace. Neither of them had become wealthy. Neither expected recognition. Yet the generosity he barely remembered had quietly multiplied into opportunities for strangers he would probably never meet. For the first time since the company collapsed, he understood something that no financial statement had ever measured. Some investments never appear on balance sheets. They continue earning returns inside human lives. As evening settled over Asheville, Duke walked downstairs to close the workshop. He reached automatically for the brown apron hanging on its hook. This time he didn't see it as an old piece of fabric. He saw years of sacrifice, thousands of hours of honest work. A widow who had refused to let bitterness define her. A son who had turned gratitude into generosity. Carefully, he smoothed one of the worn seams with his fingertips. His father had once said that wood remembered the hands that respected it. Standing there in the quiet shop, Duke began to wonder if people remembered them too. It didn't take long for the town to notice. Asheville wasn't a place where secrets stayed hidden for very long. Someone had taken a photograph through the front window of Turner Alterations and Repairs. It showed Duke Hughes wearing a faded brown work apron while sanding the arm of an old rocking chair. By sunset, the picture had spread across social media. Some people reacted with sympathy, others with disbelief. A few treated it as entertainment. The billionaire finally got a real job. "I guess luxury furniture doesn't pay anymore. I wonder how long he'll last." Duke didn't read the comments himself. Noah did. He was replacing bearings on an industrial saw when his phone buzzed repeatedly. His expression darkened as he scrolled. Grace noticed immediately. "What is it?" He turned the screen around. Someone had zoomed in on Duke's face and turned the photograph into a cruel joke. Thousands of strangers were laughing at a man they had admired only weeks earlier. Grace quietly pushed the phone back toward Noah. "Leave it. They're humiliating him. They're humiliating themselves." Noah looked unconvinced. Grace returned to her sewing machine. "People reveal their own character much faster than someone else's." Duke entered through the back door, carrying several pieces of reclaimed oak from a nearby salvage yard. Neither Grace nor Noah mentioned the photograph. He sensed something was wrong anyway. "What happened?" "Nothing important," Grace answered. "If you're protecting me, it's probably important." Noah reluctantly handed him the phone. Duke studied the screen. There were hundreds of comments. Some accused him of pretending to be humble for public sympathy. Others claimed he deserved everything that had happened. One anonymous account wrote, "A billionaire wearing an apron is still just a billionaire playing poor." Duke stared at the sentence for a long time. Then he quietly locked the phone and handed it back. "I've been called worse." "You shouldn't have to be." "No," he smiled faintly. "But I can't control strangers." Grace watched him carefully. "Does it hurt?" He considered the question honestly. It hurts that people are so quick to believe the worst. The afternoon passed in silence. Around 3 o'clock, a black luxury SUV pulled up outside the shop. A sharply dressed man stepped out carrying an expensive leather briefcase. Duke recognized him immediately. Preston Whitaker. They had once served together on the board of a regional business foundation. Preston entered the shop without removing his sunglasses. He looked around with obvious discomfort. "I've been trying to reach you. I changed my phone." "I can see that." His eyes wandered across the modest shop before settling on Duke's work clothes. "I heard the rumors." "They're mostly true." Preston lowered his voice. "Come outside." Duke followed him onto the sidewalk. For a few moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Preston sighed. "I have a proposition." Duke waited. "I know several investors who might consider helping you rebuild." "That's generous." "On one condition." "What condition?" "You need to disappear for a while." Duke frowned. "What do you mean?" "Stop working here." Preston glanced toward the shop window. "The photographs are damaging." "Damaging to whom?" "Your reputation." Duke looked down at the brown apron tied around his waist. "It's just an apron." "It makes you look desperate." "It makes me look employed." Preston shook his head impatiently. "You don't understand image management." Duke almost laughed. "For 30 years I thought I did." "This isn't the Duke Hughes people respected." "No." Duke looked directly into his eyes. "It's the Duke Hughes who existed before anyone knew my name." Preston sighed with disappointment. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe. But at least it's my mistake." The conversation ended there. Preston climbed back into his SUV and drove away without entering the shop again. Grace had watched the entire exchange through the front window. When Duke returned inside, she didn't ask what had been said. Instead, she handed him another unfinished chair. "This one's missing a leg." He smiled. "I noticed." Late that afternoon, 3 customers arrived together. One of them, a middle-aged real estate developer named Richard Collins, had purchased several custom dining tables from Hughes Artisan Furniture years earlier. He recognized Duke instantly. "Well?" Richard folded his arms. "I never thought I'd find you here." Duke nodded politely. "Good afternoon." Richard looked around the workshop. "So this is where you've ended up?" Grace continued measuring fabric without looking up. "We're a repair shop." "I can see that." Richard's tone carried unmistakable amusement. "I suppose everyone has to start somewhere." Duke answered calmly. "I'm not starting." "No. I'm continuing." Richard laughed. "You call sanding old chairs continuing? I call it honest work." The developer smirked. "I always wondered how long your pride would survive." Before Duke could respond, Grace finally looked up from her sewing machine. "It survived longer than your manners." The room became very quiet. Richard turned toward her. "Excuse me." Grace removed her glasses and folded them carefully. "I've worked with my hands for nearly 30 years. She gestured toward Duke. "So is he." She pointed toward the repaired furniture surrounding them. "Tell me which one of these pieces has less dignity because someone wearing an apron touched it." Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Grace continued. "Money changes addresses." She looked directly into his eyes. Character usually doesn't. For several seconds, nobody moved. Richard's wife, who had remained silent until then, stepped closer to one of the restored chairs. She ran her hand gently across the smooth oak surface. "This is beautiful." She looked at Duke. "You restored this?" "Yes." "It's better than when we bought our dining table years ago." Richard glanced at the chair, then at his wife, then back at Duke. His confidence faded. Without another sarcastic remark, he quietly paid for the repair work they had originally come to request. As the couple prepared to leave, Richard hesitated near the door. He turned back toward Duke. The apology seemed difficult. "I'm sorry." Duke simply nodded. "So am I." Richard looked confused. "For what?" "For how easily success makes us think we're different from everyone else." Richard lowered his eyes before walking outside. Grace returned to her sewing machine as though nothing extraordinary had happened. An hour later, Harold Jenkins stopped by, carrying a paper bag filled with fresh cinnamon rolls. "I heard somebody needed dessert." Noah laughed. "You've got good timing." Harold looked around the room. "I also heard somebody finally remembered that an honest day's work doesn't need defending." He handed one cinnamon roll to Duke. "You know something." "What?" "Hmm?" "The first time you walked into my diner after losing everything," Harold smiled warmly, "you looked like a man searching for a place to hide." He pointed toward the brown apron. "Today you look like a man who's finally found where he belongs." Duke looked down at the worn fabric tied around his waist. Only weeks earlier, he would have considered it a symbol of failure. Now surrounded by people who valued effort more than status, he realized it had quietly become something else entirely. It wasn't hiding the man he used to be, it was revealing the man he had almost forgotten. Saturday mornings were always the busiest at Turner Alterations and Repairs. By 8 o'clock, Grace had already hemmed 2 dresses, accepted 3 winter coats for repair, and promised a young father that his daughter's ballet costume would be ready before Tuesday. Duke spent the morning in the workshop behind the building, restoring a century-old walnut bench that an elderly church had donated for refinishing. Every groove in the weathered wood reminded him of the furniture his father had once built. He had almost finished repairing one cracked support when Noah walked in carrying a worn cardboard tube. "I found something while cleaning my apartment." Duke looked up. "What is it?" "I've been meaning to bring it over." Noah slid several yellowed documents onto the workbench. There were old report cards, a faded acceptance letter from Blue Ridge Technical Institute, several photographs, and finally a white envelope whose edges had softened with age. Grace stepped into the workshop carrying fresh lemonade. The moment she saw the envelope, she stopped. "You kept that," Noah smiled. "I kept everything." He carefully opened the envelope and removed a folded letter. "The paper's getting fragile." Duke recognized the company letterhead immediately. Hughes Artisan Foundation. His own signature rested at the bottom of the page. He had seen it once before. But today Noah unfolded another sheet that had remained tucked behind it. This was never mailed. Grace looked embarrassed. "You weren't supposed to see that." "What is it?" Duke asked. Noah handed him the second page. The handwriting was neat, but unmistakably personal. "Dear Mr. Hughes, you don't know my family, and you probably never will. Today I learned that my son has been given a chance to become the man his father always hoped he would be. You signed a scholarship that we could never have afforded ourselves. You will probably forget this decision by tomorrow because people like you make hundreds of them. People like me remember them forever. I cannot repay what you've done, so I will make one promise instead. If my son succeeds, I will teach him that kindness must never stop with the person who receives it. Someday, somehow, our family will pass this gift to someone else. May God bless you and your family. Grace Turner." Duke finished reading in silence. The workshop suddenly felt very still. You never sent it. Grace shook her head. I drove to the company twice. Why didn't you come inside? She laughed softly. I saw how busy you were. You should have interrupted me. No, she smiled gently. I didn't want gratitude to become another appointment on your calendar. Duke folded the letter with extraordinary care. I don't deserve this. Grace frowned. Don't say that. I signed hundreds of scholarship approvals. You signed one that changed our lives. I didn't even remember Noah's name. No, Grace replied quietly. But you remembered to help someone you'd never met. She leaned against the old workbench. Kindness doesn't become less valuable because the giver forgets it. Those words settled deeply inside Duke. For years he had measured generosity by its size. Large donations, major charity galas, public campaigns. He had never considered that the smallest decision made on an ordinary Tuesday evening while reviewing paperwork could echo through decades. Noah picked up another photograph. It showed a much younger version of himself standing proudly beside his first toolbox on graduation day. I bought this with money from my first paycheck. He placed the picture beside the scholarship letter. My instructor asked why I worked harder than everyone else. What did you tell him? Duke asked. I told him someone I'd never met believed I was worth investing in. Grace smiled through moist eyes. He called every Sunday during school. Noah laughed. You checked my grades every week. I checked whether you were eating. You checked everything. They laughed together. The sound filled the workshop with a warmth Duke hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the laughter of expensive parties or corporate celebrations. It was quieter, more honest. After lunch, Noah offered to help Duke finish restoring the church bench. The two men worked side by side. They measured replacement pieces, applied fresh glue, clamped the repaired joints. Every so often, Noah asked questions about woodworking techniques. Duke answered patiently. You explain things exactly like my instructors. I've had practice. With employees, with apprentices. He paused. I stopped spending enough time with them. Noah looked at him. You could always start again. The sentence seemed simple, yet it stayed with Duke long after the conversation moved on. Late that afternoon, a delivery driver stopped outside the shop carrying a certified envelope. It's for Mr. Hughes. Duke accepted it with mild curiosity. The return address belonged to Samuel Brooks, the federal attorney overseeing the financial investigation. Grace noticed the official seal. You don't have to open it now. I think I should. Inside was a brief letter requesting Duke's presence at the federal courthouse the following Thursday. Additional financial records had been recovered. Investigators believed they had identified several hidden companies connected to Victor Langley. More importantly, they believed Duke possessed information that could help establish the timeline of the fraud. Duke read the final sentence twice. Your cooperation may be critical to resolving this matter. He slowly lowered the letter. I have to go back. Grace understood immediately. You were always going to. I thought I was finished with all of that. You were finished running from it. She rested one hand gently on the old workbench. That's different. That evening after the shop closed, Duke remained alone in the workshop. The restored church bench stood finished beneath the soft overhead lights. He ran his hand across the smooth walnut surface. Solid, strong, ready for another generation. He looked toward the wooden hook near the door, where Grace's faded brown apron hung neatly folded. Only a few weeks earlier, he had believed his life was measured by skyscraper offices, private jets, and annual profits. Now he realized something almost impossible to ignore. The greatest investment he had ever made had not been in lumber factories or luxury furniture. It had been in a young man whose face he couldn't even remember when he signed a single scholarship form. And somehow, without asking for recognition, that forgotten act of kindness had quietly returned not as a debt to be repaid, but as a hand reaching back to lift him when he had no strength left to stand alone. The federal courthouse in downtown Asheville looked exactly as Duke remembered: cold gray stone-polished marble floors and hallways that carried every footstep a little farther than expected. Only this time he entered through a side entrance reserved for witnesses rather than executives. No television cameras waited outside. The media frenzy had shifted to newer scandals weeks earlier. To the public, Duke Hughes had already become yesterday's headline. Grace insisted on driving him. "You don't have to wait," Duke said as she parked across the street. "I know." She turned off the engine. "But I brought a book." He smiled. "I may be hours." "I've waited longer." Before he stepped out, she reached into the back seat and handed him a neatly folded brown paper lunch bag. "You'll forget to eat." Inside were a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a handwritten note tucked beside the napkin. One sentence: "Whatever happens today, tell the truth and leave the rest to God." Duke folded the note carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. It reminded him strangely of the scholarship letter he had read only days earlier. Some words were too valuable to throw away. Inside the courthouse, a federal marshal escorted him to a conference room. Samuel Brooks was already waiting. He stood to shake Duke's hand. Unlike many attorneys Duke had encountered over the past month, Brooks never treated him as either a villain or a celebrity, only as a man with information. "Thank you for coming." "I said I'd cooperate." "And you have." Brooks opened several thick binders. "We've recovered financial records from 3 shell corporations." Photographs, bank transfers, and corporate filings covered the table. Every page pointed toward Victor Langley. Millions of dollars had been quietly moved over nearly 7 years. Small amounts at first, then larger transfers hidden beneath complicated contracts. Brooks slid one document across the table. "Do you recognize this signature?" Duke looked carefully. His own name appeared at the bottom. "I signed it." "Did you authorize this transaction?" "No." "Then why is your signature there?" Duke studied the page longer. Then he noticed something subtle. The date. Brooks leaned forward. "What about it?" "I was in Seattle that day." "You remember?" "I wasn't here." He pointed toward another document. "That week we opened the Pacific Northwest showroom." Brooks checked his notes. After several moments, he nodded. "You're right." Duke continued examining the paperwork. "The signature's real." "But I signed blank authorization pages before leaving because Victor said routine supplier payments couldn't wait." Brooks looked up immediately. "You signed blank pages." Duke closed his eyes briefly. "It sounds foolish now." "It sounds trusting." "For too long." Brooks made several notes. "Victor attached those signatures to entirely different financial documents after you returned." For the first time, Duke saw exactly how the fraud had worked. It hadn't required sophisticated hacking or forged identities. It had required something much simpler: trust. The interview lasted nearly 4 hours. Brooks asked about board meetings, bank relationships, expansion plans, and every major financial decision from the previous decade. Whenever Duke didn't know an answer, he admitted it. Whenever he remembered something uncertain, he said so. There were no guesses, no attempts to protect his pride, only facts. As the meeting ended, Brooks closed the final binder. "I owe you an apology." Duke looked surprised. "For what?" "When this investigation began," Brooks hesitated, "I wasn't sure whether you were incompetent or dishonest. And now, I think you were neither." Duke remained silent. "You were a craftsman who trusted the wrong accountant." The words carried no judgment, only sadness. Outside, Grace was still waiting exactly where he had left her. She had finished her book and was knitting a small blue scarf. The moment she saw him walking toward the truck, she smiled. "How'd it go?" "I think—" He opened the passenger door. "I finally understand how everything happened." She handed him the thermos of coffee she had brought from home. "That's a start." As they drove back toward town, Duke watched autumn sunlight stretch across the mountains. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what still remained. The next morning, Noah arrived at the workshop carrying a clipboard. "I made a list." Duke looked over. "A list of what?" "Every machine in the old Hughes factory that could probably still be repaired if somebody ever bought the building." Duke laughed. "Well, you never stop planning, do you?" "I learned from you." Duke studied the handwritten notes. Several industrial sanders, a vintage lathe, hand-finishing benches, equipment he had personally selected years earlier. He ran his finger across one machine listed near the bottom. "The old German planer. You remember it?" "I spent 6 months searching for it." Noah grinned. "It still works." "How do you know?" "I asked one of the maintenance guys." The conversation was interrupted by Harold Jenkins walking through the back door, carrying a box of fresh cinnamon rolls. "I figured federal investigations deserve carbohydrates." Everyone laughed. Harold set the pastries on the workbench. Then his expression grew serious. "You know," he looked directly at Duke, "folks around town are starting to talk differently." "What do you mean?" "They're realizing Victor disappeared. And they're starting to ask why the guilty man ran while the innocent one stayed." Duke considered that quietly. Grace placed another repaired jacket onto its hanger. "The truth walks." She looked toward the front window. "Lies usually run." That afternoon, Samuel Brooks called. Duke answered on the second ring. "We found him." For a moment, Duke said nothing. "Victor?" "Yes." "He was arrested this morning at a private airport outside Atlanta." Duke closed his eyes. Not with satisfaction, with relief. Brooks continued. "We also recovered additional financial records from a storage unit he rented under another company's name." "Will they help?" "They already have." There was a brief pause. "Mr. Hughes." "Yes." "I believe your name will soon be officially cleared." After the call ended, Duke stood alone in the workshop for several minutes. The old brown apron hung on its familiar hook beside the door. He reached for it almost automatically before beginning another repair. As he tied the worn strings behind his back, he realized something unexpected. Only a month earlier, clearing his name had felt like the most important goal imaginable. Now it no longer felt like the finish line. It felt like permission to begin building something entirely different. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was filled long before the hearing began. Unlike the first days of the investigation, reporters were no longer chasing rumors. They had come because federal prosecutors were preparing to reveal thousands of pages of financial evidence collected over several years. Victor Langley sat at the defense table, wearing a navy suit that looked remarkably similar to the ones he had worn during board meetings. His hair was perfectly combed. His expression remained calm, almost rehearsed. Only his eyes betrayed him. They no longer carried the confidence of the man who once believed he could outsmart everyone around him. Duke entered quietly through the side entrance with Samuel Brooks. Grace sat several rows behind him. She had insisted on wearing her best church dress instead of work clothes. The brown apron remained folded neatly at the shop. "There was no reason to bring it today," she had told Duke that morning. "What matters today isn't what we're building. It's what we're finishing." The hearing lasted nearly 6 hours. Bank records were projected onto large screens. Wire transfers connected shell corporations that existed only on paper. Former executives testified that Victor had personally instructed them to conceal certain transactions, One accountant admitted she had questioned unusual payments years earlier, but had been threatened with losing her job. Finally, Samuel Brooks called Duke to the witness stand. The courtroom became completely silent. Duke answered every question with the same honesty he had shown throughout the investigation. He admitted signing blank authorization pages. He admitted trusting Victor too much. He admitted focusing more on craftsmanship than financial oversight. "I made serious mistakes," he told the court, "but stealing from my employees was never one of them." His voice never rose. He didn't try to sound heroic. He simply sounded truthful. When cross-examination ended, Victor asked to speak privately with Duke during a short recess. Against his attorney's advice, Duke agreed. The two men stood alone in a small consultation room. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Victor broke the silence. "You know," he said quietly, "we could have ruled this industry for another 20 years. Duke looked at him steadily. "We already had enough." Victor laughed bitterly. "There is no such thing." "There is." Victor shook his head. "You really believe that now?" "I didn't before." "What changed?" Duke thought of the tiny apartment behind Grace's shop, the repaired furniture, Noah's scholarship letter, Harold's coffee, the brown apron hanging beside the workshop door. "My definition of wealth." Victor looked away. "You'll regret not fighting harder." "I did fight." "For what?" "The people who trusted me." Victor smiled without warmth. "I fought for something bigger." "No," Duke answered quietly. "You fought for something emptier." Neither man spoke again. An hour later, the judge formally accepted Victor's guilty plea on multiple federal fraud charges. The courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters surrounded Samuel Brooks in the hallway. Others hurried toward Duke. "Mr. Hughes, do you feel vindicated? Will you rebuild Hughes Artisan Furniture? Are you planning to sue anyone else?" Duke answered only one question. "The truth matters." Then he walked away. By evening, every major news outlet carried the same headline: "Billionaire cleared. Former partner admits years of fraud." The following morning, Duke returned to Turner Alterations and Repairs before sunrise. Grace was already preparing coffee. She looked up as he entered. "So?" he smiled. "It's over." She poured him a cup. "No." He looked puzzled. "No. The investigation is over." She slid the coffee toward him. "Life keeps going." Duke laughed. "You always know how to make big moments feel ordinary." "They usually are." Just before lunch, a sleek silver sedan stopped outside the shop. Grace noticed it first. A woman stepped out wearing an elegant camel-colored coat and oversized sunglasses. Even from across the street, Duke recognized Eleanor. She stood outside the shop for nearly a minute before gathering enough courage to enter. The bell above the door rang softly. Grace greeted her politely. "Good afternoon." Eleanor nodded. "I'm here to see Duke." Grace looked towards the workshop. "He's in the back." Duke emerged wiping sawdust from his hands. The brown apron still covered his flannel shirt. For a brief moment, neither former spouse spoke. Eleanor finally broke the silence. "I saw the news. I figured you would." She looked around the modest shop. "I've been trying to reach you. I changed my number." "I know." There was another awkward silence. Then she took a slow breath. "I made a mistake." Duke listened quietly. "I was afraid. Of losing money." She lowered her eyes. "Of losing everything." "You did." She looked back up. "I know." Her voice trembled slightly. "When things started falling apart, I convinced myself that leaving would protect me." "Did it?" She didn't answer immediately. "No." She looked around the little shop once more. "I've never felt more alone." Duke didn't respond with anger. He simply waited. "I know I don't deserve another chance." No. I was hoping. She struggled to finish the sentence. Maybe we could start over. Duke remained silent for several seconds. He remembered the driveway, the cardboard box, the wedding ring resting on top, the motel, the freezing night inside the rental car. Then he remembered something else. Grace opening the shop door without asking for explanations. Harold serving coffee without judgment. Noah extending his hand with genuine respect. He realized the difference wasn't who had stayed, it was why. Finally he spoke. I don't hate you. Relief briefly crossed Eleanor's face. But forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. She nodded slowly. I understand. I truly hope you find peace. And us, Duke smiled sadly. We already belong to different lives. Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes. She accepted the answer without argument. As she turned to leave, Grace quietly handed her the coat she had absent-mindedly left hanging near the door. Take care of yourself. Eleanor whispered a sincere, thank you, before walking outside. Duke watched through the window as her car disappeared around the corner. He felt lighter. Not because he had rejected her, because he no longer carried bitterness. Grace walked over beside him. You all right? He nodded. I expected victory to feel louder. What does it feel like? He looked around the small workshop. The restored rocking chairs, the humming sewing machine, the smell of fresh coffee, the afternoon sunlight warming old wooden floors. It feels, he smiled gently, quiet. Grace smiled too. The best kinds usually are. That evening, after closing the shop, Duke untied the faded brown apron and carefully repaired a small tear along one of its worn pockets with needle and thread. Grace watched without saying anything. He wasn't fixing fabric anymore. He was preserving the symbol of the life that had quietly taught him the difference between rebuilding a fortune and rebuilding a soul. Winter gave way to an early North Carolina spring. Dogwood trees bloomed along quiet streets, and sunlight lingered a little longer each evening. Life at Turner Alterations and Repairs settled into a comfortable rhythm. Customers came and went. Grace repaired coats that no longer needed winter lining. Duke restored antique furniture in the workshop behind the shop, taking on just enough commissions to help with expenses. For the first time in decades, his calendar wasn't filled 6 months in advance. Strangely, he didn't miss it. One Monday morning, Samuel Brooks stopped by the shop carrying a thick envelope. I figured this deserved a personal delivery. Duke invited him inside. Grace poured coffee without asking whether he wanted any. Samuel smiled. I've heard about your hospitality. Grace shrugged. Coffee solves more problems than lawyers. Samuel laughed. I won't argue with that. He placed the envelope on the work table. The court approved the financial recovery. Duke opened it slowly. Inside were official documents outlining the assets recovered from Victor Langley's hidden companies. Insurance settlements, seized accounts, and liquidation of fraudulent holdings had resulted in a substantial financial judgment. The amount was enough to make Duke wealthy again. Not quite the billionaire he once was, but wealthier than most people could imagine. Samuel watched his face carefully. I expected a different reaction. What reaction? Most people smile. Duke quietly closed the folder. I've already lost the only things money couldn't replace. Samuel nodded. I thought you might say that. After he left, Grace continued pinning a dress without mentioning the envelope. Finally, Duke asked, Aren't you curious? I know there's money inside. There is. Then the question isn't how much. She looked up. The question is what kind of man opens that envelope? Those words stayed with him all afternoon. That evening, Duke drove alone through Asheville. Almost without thinking, he found himself outside the old Hughes Artisan Furniture Factory. The gates were locked. Weeds pushed through cracks in the parking lot. The company sign had been removed months earlier, leaving only faded outlines on the brick wall. He parked across the street. For several minutes, he simply looked. Memories filled every corner of the property. The loading dock where new employees nervously reported for their first day. The courtyard where families gathered during company picnics. The workshop where his father had proudly visited after the first expansion. He realized something unexpected. He didn't want the building back because it had once made him rich. He wanted it back because it had once given hundreds of people meaningful work. The following morning, he spread blueprints across Grace's kitchen table. She looked at them over the rim of her coffee mug. "I know that building." "So do I. You want to buy it?" "I do." Grace remained quiet. He expected questions. Instead, she asked only one. "To make furniture?" He thought carefully before answering. "No." She smiled. "Good." That surprised him. "You don't even know my idea." "I know you." She folded the newspaper and set it aside. The old Duke would have wanted to rebuild the company. And the new one? The new one wants to rebuild people. Duke looked down at the blueprints. She was right. Later that week, he invited Noah and Harold to the apartment. The four of them gathered around the tiny kitchen table that suddenly seemed too small. Duke explained his vision. "I don't want another luxury furniture company." Harold leaned forward. "What do you want?" "A place where people get another chance." Noah nodded slowly. "Go on." "I've met too many people these past few months who can't find work." He pointed toward a notebook filled with handwritten ideas. Men in their 50s laid off after factories closed. Women returning to work after caring for family. Veterans. People rebuilding their lives after bankruptcy. People society has quietly decided are too old or too broken to start over. Grace listened without interrupting. Duke continued. "They don't need charity. They need skills. They need someone willing to believe they're still valuable." Noah's eyes brightened. "So, we teach woodworking, furniture repair, machine maintenance, small business skills." Harold grinned. "And coffee?" Everyone laughed. "Definitely coffee." Grace finally spoke. "Who pays for all this?" "I do." "No." Duke looked confused. Grace folded her hands. "We do." He shook his head immediately. "I can't ask you." "You didn't." She stood and disappeared into the bedroom. A minute later, she returned, carrying a small metal cash box. She placed it gently on the table. "I've been saving for 15 years." Duke stared at it. "Grace." She opened the lid. Inside were neatly organized envelopes. Savings from sewing, money left over after paying bills, tips she had quietly set aside. "I was going to renovate the shop." "You should." "I've changed my mind." He looked at her in disbelief. "I can't take this." "You aren't taking it." She smiled warmly. "I'm investing it." Noah reached into his backpack. "I guess we're all doing that." He pulled out another envelope. "My overtime pay." Harold chuckled. "Well, now I have to participate." He placed a folded check on top of the others. "It isn't much." Duke looked around the table. One woman with a tiny alteration shop. One mechanic, one diner owner. None of them were wealthy. Yet each had offered something without being asked. His eyes became moist. "I don't know what to say," Grace answered softly. "You don't have to?" She looked directly at him. "Years ago, you believed in people before you knew their names." She gently pushed the envelopes toward him. "Now it's our turn." 3 months later, the purchase was complete. The abandoned factory no longer carried the Hughes Artisan Furniture sign. Instead, workers carefully installed a new wooden sign above the entrance, the Hughes Second Chance Workshop. No titles, no mention of luxury, no promises of fortune, only opportunity. On the morning construction began, Duke unlocked the front doors. Dust covered the floors. Old machines sat silent beneath protective tarps. Broken windows let beams of sunlight cut through the darkness. Grace walked beside him, carrying the faded brown apron. Without saying a word, she hung it on a simple wooden hook near the entrance to the main workshop. Duke smiled. "It belongs there." Grace nodded. "So everyone who walks in remembers?" "Remembers what?" She looked around the empty building that would soon be filled with new voices. "That every meaningful beginning starts with someone willing to do ordinary work with extraordinary heart." Duke stood silently beneath the new sign. Months earlier, he had lost a company. Standing inside the quiet factory, he realized he had been given something far more important: a reason to build again. The first class at the Hughes Second Chance Workshop began on a rainy Monday in early September. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no television crews, no politicians waiting to deliver speeches. Duke had received several invitations from local officials who wanted to turn the opening into a public event, but he politely declined every one of them. "If this place succeeds," he told Samuel Brooks over the phone, "it should be because of the people inside it, not because someone took a picture outside." At 7:30 that morning, 12 students gathered inside the renovated workshop. They couldn't have looked more different. A 59-year-old former textile worker whose factory had closed after 35 years. A widowed mother returning to work after caring for her disabled husband until his death. A military veteran struggling to rebuild his civilian life. A restaurant cook recovering from surgery that had ended his previous career. A man who had spent 18 months unemployed because every interview ended with the same sentence: "We're looking for someone younger." They stood quietly beside workbenches that smelled of fresh pine and machine oil. Some avoided eye contact. Others folded their arms as if waiting to be disappointed. Duke recognized the expression. It wasn't laziness. It was the look of people who had been told no so many times that hope had begun to feel dangerous. Grace arrived carrying 2 enormous insulated containers, coffee, as always. Behind her came Harold with trays of warm biscuits and cinnamon rolls. "Nobody learns woodworking on an empty stomach," he announced. Laughter rippled through the room. The tension eased almost immediately. Noah clapped his hands together. "All right, everybody." He pointed toward rows of neatly organized tools. "Before we touch any machines, we're going to learn everyone's name. Not their resume, not their failures, their names." For the next hour, introductions filled the workshop. One by one, people spoke. Some confidently, some barely above a whisper. Nobody interrupted, nobody judged. When everyone finished, Duke stepped forward. He didn't stand on a stage. He stood beside an old workbench that had once belonged to his father. "My name is Duke Hughes." Several students smiled knowingly. Most had recognized him already. "I've built furniture. I've built companies. I've also lost almost everything I thought mattered." The room became silent. "I won't promise any of you an easy future." He rested one hand on the workbench. "But I can promise you'll never be treated like you're disposable while you're here." He paused. "Wood with cracks isn't worthless. It simply needs someone willing to repair it properly." No applause followed, only thoughtful silence. It was enough. The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with coffee brewed by Grace. Noah taught machinery maintenance. Duke demonstrated woodworking techniques. Afternoons focused on practical projects that local families had donated for restoration. Nothing was wasted. Broken dining tables became teaching lessons. Damaged rocking chairs became exercises in patience. Old cabinets became opportunities to practice craftsmanship. Grace quietly watched from the corner while repairing work aprons, replacing missing buttons, and making lunches for anyone who had forgotten to bring one. She insisted nobody leave hungry. "If people worry about lunch," she often said, "they can't focus on tomorrow." By October, something remarkable had begun happening. Students who had arrived looking defeated started staying after class. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. They compared ideas, helped each other, shared job leads. One afternoon, Duke found 2 students repairing another classmate's toolbox after he'd accidentally dropped it. Nobody had assigned the task. They simply did it. The kindness spreading through the workshop required no instruction. One Friday morning, a local furniture store owner visited the workshop looking for skilled employees. He watched quietly for nearly 2 hours. Before leaving, he handed Duke 6 business cards. "I need dependable people. You've got them." Within a week, 3 graduates had full-time jobs. The news spread quickly. Soon another manufacturer requested applicants. Then a cabinet company. Then a restoration business specializing in historic homes. Each success changed the atmosphere inside the workshop. People began walking differently. Shoulders straightened. Conversations grew louder. Hope had a sound. It sounded like laughter returning. Near the entrance, the old brown apron remained hanging on its wooden hook. Visitors often asked why such an ordinary piece of fabric occupied such an important place. Duke always answered the same way. That apron reminds us that dignity isn't stitched into expensive suits. One afternoon, a television producer requested permission to film a feature about the workshop. She wanted dramatic shots, interviews, inspirational music. Duke declined politely. Instead, Grace invited her inside for coffee. The producer spent nearly an hour talking with students, listening. When she finally prepared to leave, she walked toward the brown apron. "I thought this would be the story." She pointed toward it. Grace smiled gently. "It isn't." "No. It's only the reminder." The story walks around the room every morning. The producer looked across the workshop. A former factory worker patiently teaching another student how to sharpen chisels, Noah laughing beside an old planer, Harold delivering sandwiches, Duke kneeling beside a nervous beginner showing him how to steady trembling hands before making the first cut. The producer lowered her camera. "I think I understand. You don't need the apron." Grace nodded. "You need the people." That winter, just before Christmas, the workshop held its first graduation ceremony. Nothing extravagant. Folding chairs borrowed from a nearby church. Homemade cookies. Coffee. Families filled the room. Children cheered louder than anyone else. One by one, graduates crossed the small stage to receive certificates they had earned through months of hard work. When the final name was called, everyone unexpectedly remained standing. A former textile worker named Evelyn stepped forward carrying a wrapped package. "This is for you." She handed it to Duke. Inside was a simple wooden plaque made by every graduate together. Burned into the oak surface were just 11 words. "Thank you for seeing our future before we could see it ourselves." Duke stared at the plaque for several seconds. His voice nearly disappeared. "I didn't." Everyone looked confused. He turned toward Grace. "She did." Grace immediately shook her head. "No." She pointed quietly toward the faded brown apron hanging by the entrance. "It started there." Duke smiled. "It started with someone who opened a door. Outside, snow began falling gently over Asheville. Inside the workshop, surrounded by people whose lives were beginning again, Duke realized that success no longer sounded like applause at a shareholders' meeting. It sounded like 12 graduates leaving through the front door, with job offers in their pockets, confidence in their hearts, and the quiet determination to become the reason someone else would never have to give up. By the second spring, the Hughes Second Chance Workshop had become something the town hadn't expected. People no longer described it as the place where the billionaire who lost everything had started over. Instead, they called it the place where people remembered they still mattered. Every Monday morning, new applications arrived from across North Carolina. Some came neatly typed on computers, others were handwritten on lined notebook paper. A few contained coffee stains, folded corners, or spelling mistakes. Duke read every one of them himself. He wasn't looking for perfect resumes. He was looking for people who still wanted to try. One rainy afternoon after the last class had ended, Grace noticed an older man standing across the street. He didn't come inside. He simply watched the workshop through the front windows. His coat hung loosely over thin shoulders, and a worn backpack rested at his feet. Rain soaked the brim of his faded baseball cap, yet he made no attempt to find shelter. Grace quietly placed 2 cups of coffee on a tray. "You expecting someone?" Noah asked. "I think someone is expecting Hope." She crossed the street without hesitation. "Afternoon," she said gently. The man looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "I've been standing here." "I noticed." "I didn't want to bother anyone." Grace handed him one of the coffees. "You weren't." He accepted it carefully, warming his hands against the paper cup. "My name's Mason." "I'm Grace." He nodded towards the workshop. "I've been reading about this place." "What did you hear?" "That people get second chances." She smiled. "Sometimes." He lowered his eyes. "I've run out of first chances." Grace didn't ask any more questions. Instead, she pointed toward the building. "Come inside before the coffee gets cold." Mason hesitated. "My clothes are dirty. So are most of the work clothes in there." He looked at her for several long seconds before following. Inside the workshop, Duke was wiping sawdust from a workbench. He turned as the door opened. Grace simply said, "This is Mason." Nothing else. No explanation, no warning. Duke stepped forward and shook the man's hand. "I'm Duke." Mason seemed surprised. "You don't want to know why I'm here. I imagine you'll tell me when you're ready." The answer caught Mason completely off guard. For nearly an hour they sat together drinking coffee, while the workshop slowly emptied. Eventually, Mason began talking. He had spent 27 years managing a paper mill outside Charlotte. When the factory closed, he believed finding another job would take only a few weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. His savings disappeared. His wife passed away after a long illness. Medical bills consumed what little remained. Eventually, he lost the house. Every interview ended politely. "We've decided to move in another direction. You have excellent experience. We're looking for someone with more flexibility." He understood what those words really meant. Too old, too expensive, too easy to overlook. I stopped introducing myself as a manager. Mason looked into his untouched coffee. "Then I stopped introducing myself at all." The room remained quiet. Finally, Duke spoke. "Do you know anything about woodworking?" Mason smiled weakly. "My grandfather taught me how to build birdhouses." "Good." Mason looked confused. "Good. That means we're starting with experience." A nervous laugh escaped Mason. "I don't even own proper work boots." Noah disappeared into the storage room without saying a word. A minute later, he returned, carrying a pair of sturdy boots that another graduate had donated after finding full-time employment. "They're about your size." Mason stared at them. "I can't afford." "They've already been paid for." Grace placed a folded lunch on the table. "Someone else insisted we keep helping the next person." Tears gathered in Mason's eyes. "I don't want charity." Duke shook his head. "This isn't charity." He pointed toward the workshop. "You'll be here at 8 tomorrow. You'll work. You'll learn. And someday you'll help the person who walks through that door after you." Mason slowly nodded. "I can do that." "No." Duke smiled warmly. "You already are." The next morning, Mason arrived 15 minutes early. His donated boots had been cleaned until they almost looked new. Grace handed him the familiar brown apron. For a moment, he simply held it. "It belongs to someone else." "It belongs to everyone who respects honest work," Grace replied. Carefully, Mason tied it around his waist. Watching from across the room, Duke suddenly remembered the first morning Grace had handed that same apron to him. He had been ashamed. Mason looked grateful. What had once symbolized his own broken pride had become an invitation for someone else's new beginning. Weeks passed. Mason learned quickly. Years of factory experience returned in unexpected ways. His measurements were precise. His work habits disciplined. Soon he began helping newer students who struggled with machinery. One afternoon, a young apprentice accidentally ruined an expensive oak panel. The young man looked ready to quit. Before Duke could say anything, Mason walked over. "I've broken bigger things." The apprentice looked up nervously. "You have?" "I once shut down an entire production line." "What happened?" "I learned." He picked up another piece of oak. "Now let's both learn something today." Duke smiled quietly from across the room. The circle had already begun. A month later, Mason received an offer from a custom cabinet manufacturer. When he returned to tell everyone, Grace organized a small celebration with homemade peach cobbler. Harold arrived carrying fresh coffee. Noah insisted on taking a group photograph. Before leaving, Mason walked toward the wooden hook beside the entrance. The brown apron still hung there. He touched the worn fabric gently. "I'll never forget this place." Duke stood beside him. "Don't." "I won't." Mason looked directly at him. "When I thought my life was over." His voice trembled. "You didn't give me money. You gave me tomorrow." Duke shook his head. "I only opened the door." Mason smiled. "That's all anyone ever really needs." After he left, Duke remained standing near the entrance. Students laughed inside the workshop. Machines hummed steadily. Grace folded freshly washed aprons. Noah explained a repair technique to two newcomers. Duke looked once more at the faded brown apron hanging quietly on its hook. Years ago, it had belonged to a housekeeper who believed dignity lived in honest work. Today, it belonged to every person who walked through those doors, believing their best years were behind them, and left believing their best work might still be ahead. 5 years passed more quietly than anyone expected. The Hughes Second Chance Workshop never became the largest training center in North Carolina. It never expanded into dozens of locations. There were no glossy advertisements promising overnight success. Instead, it grew the way oak trees grow slowly, patiently, almost unnoticed, until one day people realized how much shade it had begun to offer. By its 5th anniversary, more than 400 men and women had completed the workshop's training programs. Some found jobs restoring historic homes across the Blue Ridge Mountains. Others became cabinet makers, maintenance technicians, furniture repair specialists, or apprentices in family-owned businesses. A few eventually opened workshops of their own. Nearly every graduate returned at least once. Not because they had to, because someone new always needed encouragement on the first day. The wooden sign above the entrance had faded slightly under years of sun and rain. No one replaced it. Duke said the weathered lettering reminded everyone that meaningful things were allowed to age. Inside, very little had changed. Grace still arrived before sunrise every morning. She brewed coffee before turning on the lights. She quietly placed fresh flowers near the reception desk every Monday, usually picked from the small garden behind her shop. Harold still appeared unexpectedly with cinnamon rolls whenever he believed people looked tired. Noah had become the lead instructor for machinery and industrial maintenance. Students respected him not because of his title, but because they knew he had once stood exactly where they were standing. And near the entrance, hanging from the same wooden hook, polished smooth by thousands of passing hands, remained the faded brown apron. Visitors often assumed it belonged in a museum display. Grace refused every suggestion to frame it behind glass. "It isn't a souvenir," she always said. "It's still working." One bright Saturday afternoon, the workshop held another graduation ceremony. Families filled every seat. Children wandered between workbenches, while grandparents proudly took photographs. Among the graduates sat a young woman named Olivia, who had escaped an abusive relationship and rebuilt her life through the program. Beside her was a former truck driver recovering from a serious injury. Near the back sat a refugee who had arrived in America with little more than a backpack and determination. Each story was different. Each carried the same quiet thread of hope. When the final certificate had been presented, the audience expected Duke to give his usual short congratulations. Instead, he remained silent for several moments. Age had added more silver to his hair. Fine lines surrounded eyes that no longer carried the constant pressure of protecting an empire. He stepped away from the podium and stood beside the old workbench that had once belonged to his father. "I used to believe success was measured by how many buildings carried my company's name." A few people smiled. "I was wrong." The room grew still. "I thought losing my fortune was the greatest tragedy of my life." He glanced toward Grace, who stood quietly near the entrance. "I was wrong about that, too." He looked around the workshop. "The greatest thing I ever lost was the illusion that money could tell me who truly cared." Several graduates nodded quietly. "When everything disappeared." His voice softened. The people who stayed weren't the ones sitting in boardrooms. They were the people serving coffee, repairing clothes, sharing sandwiches, opening doors." He turned toward the brown apron. "That apron has never represented poverty. It has never represented failure. It represents the kind of work that keeps families together when nobody is watching." Grace lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Duke smiled. "Years ago, I believed I gave Grace's family an opportunity." He gently shook his head. "The truth is, she gave me back my life." The audience erupted into warm applause. Grace quietly wiped away a tear before pretending she needed to straighten a nearby chair. After the ceremony, graduates and families slowly drifted outside into the warm afternoon sunshine. Children played beneath the old maple tree near the entrance. Someone started a small barbecue behind the workshop. Laughter filled the air. Duke wandered back inside, alone. The building felt peaceful after the crowd had gone. He walked slowly toward the wooden hook. The brown apron still hung exactly where Grace had placed it years before. He reached out and carefully lifted it from the hook. The fabric had become softer with age. The repaired pocket he had stitched years earlier remained secure. He smiled to himself. Behind him, Grace entered, carrying a tray of empty coffee cups. "I thought I'd find you here." He folded the apron carefully. "You know." He looked at her. "I've been thinking. That can be dangerous." He laughed. "My father used to say wood remembers the hands that respect it." Grace nodded. "I remember. I finally understand what he meant." She waited. "It wasn't only about furniture." "No. It was about people." Grace smiled. "They remember too." Together they rehung the apron on its familiar hook. Neither tried to make it perfectly straight. Its slight tilt had become part of its story. As the sun began setting beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains, Mason arrived unexpectedly with a young man in his early 20s. The young stranger looked nervous. "He needs a second chance," Mason said quietly. Duke looked at the young man, then at Mason. Without asking for explanations, he walked to the entrance, removed the brown apron from its hook once more, and held it out with both hands. "Welcome." The young man accepted it carefully. His hands trembled just as Duke's had years before. Outside, laughter continued beneath the evening sky. Inside, another life quietly began again. The workshop lights glowed warmly through the windows as darkness settled over Asheville. and on the wooden hook beside the entrance waiting patiently until it would be needed again. There remained an empty space, a quiet reminder that kindness is never finished. It simply waits for the next person willing to wear it. There are moments when success attracts crowds, applause, and admiration, but those moments don't reveal the true measure of a life. The real measure appears when the applause fades, the titles disappear, and the doors that once opened effortlessly begin to close. That's when we discover who sees us for our achievements and who sees us for our humanity. A single act of kindness may seem small when it is given. A signature on a scholarship, a bowl of hot soup, a spare room, a shared meal, or simply choosing to sit beside someone everyone else has abandoned can change a future in ways we may never fully understand. The greatest gifts are often not money or influence, but dignity, opportunity, and the belief that another person still has value. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Has someone ever stood beside you when the rest of the world walked away? Share your story in the comments, because your experience may become the encouragement someone else desperately needs today. If you enjoy stories about compassion, resilience, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more journeys that remind us how powerful ordinary kindness can be.